Hello, I'm Understanding Politics, and in this channel I explain political theories and debates to students as well as curious and passionate people, just like you. Given that this is a fairly big topic, I have structured this lecture in 4 macro sections. In the first one, I will explain the Roman monarchy, in the second one, the Republic, the third one will explore Cicero's interpretation of the Roman political experience, and in the last one, we will briefly talk about Rome as an empire. The Roman political society of the origins was simple. Society was structured through the gens, a group of families with a common ancestor, their heads, the patres familiarum, and the rex, the father of the family, the pater familias, had sovereign power over the members of the family, and the rex, the king, was in turn elected by a pater that had the auspicium, the possibility to interpret the will of the gods. The king, or rex, had imperium, meaning sovereign power that extended to military, religion, and justice. He was assisted by the Senate, a council of older people, but de facto the patres familiarum, a council of priests that instructed him on matter of religion, and by the populus, that we normally would translate as people, but this term only applied to warriors. As a matter of fact, the populus confirmed the rex by acclamation. The rest of the people, the plebis, was excluded by the civitas, or we could also say from the exercise of power. The tension between rich people that could buy themselves arms and join the army and poorer people was a constant in Roman history. But eventually, the larger use of the infantry over the knights with horses increased the participation of poorer people in the army. The territory was divided into conscriptions that were relevant both for tax purposes and to understand how many warriors specific conscriptions had to send to the populace. These conscriptions were called centuria, and there was even a council, comitia centuriata, that with the advent of the Republic came to decide over war and peace and could even elect magistrates and praetors. After a while, the rex was substituted by a yearly magistrate, then 2 praetors, and finally 2 consuls, who could limit each other's decisions through the ius interdicendi. This happened when the Romans freed themselves from the supremacy of the Etruscans. But the shift from kings to consuls is also what determined the end of the monarchy, with its famous 7 historical kings, and the beginning of the Roman Republic. A major difference between kings and consuls was the limitation over the duration of the mandate. Another one was the formalization of the path that had to be taken. The cursus honorum was created to avoid that people skipped phases in their professional administrative growth. At the same time, there was a clear distinction between roles cum imperio, with power, and those cum potestate, which simply consisted in following procedures codified by the law. The plebis increasingly demanded to be represented and eventually got their tribunes. At the beginning they were 2, then 4, and finally 10. They came to be fundamental as they could use the ius auxilia and the ius intercessionis to prevent illegal arrests and block decisions of the Senate when they were against the interests of the plebis. These tribunes were chosen in the Concilia Plebis Tributa, a council that could also adopt legislation that was affecting only the plebis, the so-called plebiscitum. Eventually, the civitas came to equalize patricians, rich people, and the plebis in the civitas, the overall group of citizens with the Lex Hortensia of 286 BC. One essential element that was expressed by the Roman experience of politics was law. The ius, or Roman legislation, was the dimension through which the imperium, the power, could be exerted and expressed. This is one major distinction between the Roman and the Greek's idea of politics. Another one was the distinction between the private and public life of individuals. Of course, this was also coded in legislation. On the one hand, there was a type of legislation, the ius civile, that regulated relationships among individual civitas. On the other hand, the ius publicum regulated the organization of the citizenry as a whole. When the judges were appointed to regulate controversies among individuals, of course they based their judgment on the ius civile, whereas ius publicum was instructing the whole civitas in relation to the organs of power. This is where the res publica, literally the common thing, differed from the monarchy. The former was based on a strict implementation of the law, the latter on the arbitrary decisions of individuals. And this is why, as I said in this past video, republics cannot be fully equated to democracies. Republics can be democracies, but they could be very much autocracies. On the other hand, democracies do not necessarily implement the rule of law, but can base their actions on the inconsistent changing moods of the people. A final element to mention to understand the Roman interpretation of politics lies in how power was conceived. There were at least three terms employed to describe power in different forms. They were imperium, auctoritas, and potestas. Imperium was unlimited power, actually the original power that extended to the whole republic and that stemmed from the existence of the political community. Potestas was power manifested through the will of magistrates in reason of their position. As such, it was limited by the law and exerted only in specific decisions and matters, as in the case of judges. Finally, auctoritas gave prominence to specific organs of the state in consideration of their attributed value. For instance, the Senate had to be consulted before certain decisions could be implemented in reason of its authority. To sum up, potestas was administrative power, auctoritas gave organization to the different organs of the republic, whereas imperium was the manifestation of real political power. The evaluation of politics in ancient Rome at the time of the republic was done by Cicero, a philosopher, orator, and a politician himself. Among his most important works there are the De Republica, De Legibus, and De Officiis. He was a strong supporter of the Republic, and hence an opposer of Julius Caesar, that in response to the crisis was proposing the reinstitution of a monarchy. As ancient Greeks, Cicero was strongly convinced that politics was one of the most noble and important occupations. But unlike Plato, for instance, he was a strong supporter of the idea that politics should not be only theorized but also practiced, so to be able to put in action the values and principles discussed at the philosophical level. This meant, for instance, that there was no use in evaluating theoretically the best form of government. Rather, it should be conceived how to improve the already existing Roman constitution. For him, as generally for Romans, legislation was the natural outcome of societies, and as such, legislation was a direct emanation of power. You see how the constitutive elements of nowadays society are deeply intertwined with the Roman conception of politics. Interesting to note is the fact that the political community, what we today call state, was the polis in ancient Greece. But Cicero never referred to the political community with the expression civitas, the literal translation of polis. Rather, he constantly used the expression res publica, the common thing, the republic. This is also at odds with the geopolitical essential unities of these two different worlds. Ancient Greece would be a series of poleis, and at most a system of alliance among different poleis. But given that the core of the idea of politics in ancient Rome coincided with legislation and not with councils in the agora, then territories could be way more extended. Rome was a way larger state and eventually an empire. Cicero appreciated that in the res publica there was some sort of equilibrium among senate, consuls, and plebis tribunes. But given that he was personally supportive of the elite, he believed that it was only natural that the senate had more auctoritas. Finally, the Roman philosopher was the theoretician of the republican liberty, consisting in the idea that Roman citizens had a political liberty that empowered institutions. Hundreds of years later, this concept will be elaborated by Jean Bodin as sovereignty. When in 31 AC Octavianus Augustus won over Antony, civil wars terminated, and the Roman Empire started. Still, Augustus aimed to create a connection with the old republican regime and never wanted to be reinstated as rex. De facto though, while all the institutions such as the Senate remained in function, most of the imperium of the absolute power was with the emperor. Formally though, Augustus was recognized as princeps senatus, and his right to imperium was hence emanated from the auctoritas of the Senate. The princeps eventually became absolute emperor with Diocletian, and in the new interpretation, the emperor had the divine mission of uniting the whole world under Roman leadership. The favor of gods, and with Christianity, God, was represented by military victories. I explore more in depth the idea of empire, both in general and in the Roman experience, in the linked videos. But this lecture is over. Thank you for watching.